I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and I'm back at the National Portrait Gallery for part 2 of every single painting in the Tudor Gallery. In part 1 of this video, I covered the first half of the National Portrait Gallery's most popular room, the Tudor Gallery. We explored the emergence of the Tudor dynasty, starting all the way back with Henry VI and Edward IV and the Wars of the Roses, through to the death of Henry VIII's sixth wife, Catherine Parr. If you haven't watched that video, I would suggest starting there, but if you're more interested in Elizabethan history and the Golden Age, then this is the video for you. Today, we're going to cover the remaining monarchs of the Tudor period, Henry VIII's children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, as well as fascinating characters like Mary Queen of Scots, Sir Francis Drake, and Sir Walter Raleigh, and many others, as well as the political intrigue and groundbreaking changes that took place during this era. I'm also going to focus on the symbolism and details in each of these portraits. Remember, portraits like these were the day's Instagram. Remember, I offer private tours of the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, and I would love to show you around. My contact details are below. If you enjoy this video, I'm always grateful when my viewers support my channel. You can do this by liking, commenting, and subscribing, becoming a member, or leaving me a tip on PayPal or buying me a coffee. The details are all below. Whether you're planning a visit to the National Portrait Gallery or you're just traveling vicariously from home, this tour will make you feel like you've stepped foot into this newly reopened London institution. Now let's get started with our boy king of the day, Edward VI. Now, as you may remember from part 1, boy kings named Edward don't seem to have the greatest of luck in this period of English history. After all, Edward V was never even coronated and is believed to have been murdered at the age of 12, potentially by his uncle Richard III while in the Tower of London. This Edward doesn't live much longer. Let's talk about his portrait by Master John's workshop. Master John is attempting to remind us of the grandeur and gravitas of Holbein's massive portraits of Edward's father, Henry VIII, to show that the Tudor legacy will continue with this boy king. This deliberately wide-legged pose is meant to mimic the Whitehall cartoon, which we covered in part 1. The National Portrait Gallery conducted X-ray analysis to reveal that Edward used to have an even wider stance, but the artist altered the position of Edward's right foot because the pose probably looked unnatural for the young boy. He was the only son of Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour, who we talked about extensively in part 1, and he ascended to the throne in 1547 when he was only 9 years old. Since he was too young to rule on his own, a council was appointed to help, headed by 2 successive appointed Protestant protectors, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, Thomas Seymour's brother, and then John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Though Henry had left a provision for the council of 16 executors and 12 councilmen, it was soon decided that Uncle Edward would take on the lion's share of the role, but he had a challenger, his brother Thomas. Now you might remember Thomas Seymour from part 1. He's often depicted as a scheming, power-hungry player in his nephew's court, desperate to get his hands on as much power as possible. He even proposed to a 13-year-old Elizabeth right after her father's death. Around this time, he got the permission of King Edward VI, his nephew, to secretly marry Henry VIII's widow, his old flame Catherine Parr, but she soon died in childbirth. This secret marriage and many other actions angered Uncle Edward, and he arrested his own brother and had him executed for treason in 1549. Now, we're not too sad about this, because there is very good reason to believe that Thomas Seymour was a sexual predator who potentially sexually assaulted young Elizabeth while she was in Catherine Parr's household. Now, Uncle Edward didn't have much longer to live himself. He was beloved by the people because he did try to improve the lives of commoners, but he was antagonistic with other members of the council. After disastrous military campaigns and a budgetary crisis, trumped-up charges of treason were levelled against him, and he was executed in 1552 at Tower Hill, in front of a crowd of thousands who had come to say farewell to the good Duke. The next Lord Protector was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and remember that name, he's Robert Dudley's father. He was very worried about King Edward's poor health and the fact that his Catholic sister Mary was next in line to the throne. In 1552, he convinced Edward to change the order of succession to make his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, next in line, and she was just 14 or 15 at the time. Now we'll come back to Lady Jane Grey in a few minutes, but for now we need to say farewell to young King Edward. Sadly, Edward died, likely of tuberculosis, just before his 16th birthday. And here's a great way to say goodbye. This is a very unusual portrait of Edward VI, painted when he became king at the age of 9. He's depicted using a distorted perspective called anamorphosis. This is essentially a parlor trick where the artist, the Netherlandish court painter William Scots, is showing you his skill and the viewer is expected to be amazed. Now for us, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal. However, for a spectator in the 16th century, this would have been truly dazzling and unbelievable, kind of like going to an IMAX movie. If we stand all the way to the right, we can see Edward in the correct perspective, but when we move around, he becomes distorted and drawn out like a funhouse mirror. It made quite an impression. This specific portrait is referenced by numerous foreign visitors to Whitehall from the end of the 16th century, so we know it was prominently displayed. An even more famous example of anamorphosis is the famous skull found in Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors, which I cover extensively in my video about the top 10 paintings in the National Gallery, which I have just linked above. Now, it's time to speak about Queen Mary I. But don't confuse her with Mary Tudor. That was Henry's sister. And she's not Mary Stuart or Mary Queen of Scots. Those are the same person, and she was Mary's cousin. Mary is known simply as Mary I, although you might have heard her infamous nickname, Bloody Mary. It was painted around 1544 when she was 28 years old and still officially known as Lady Mary. She is as fair and dewy as any Tudor girl in this painting, and this is in direct contrast to the crone-like reputation she will gain after phantom pregnancies, an inability to have a child, and her predilection for attending Protestant executions from watchtowers while eating roast chicken and drinking red wine. Rarely does the word infamous seem as appropriate as it does with Mary I. She earned that grisly nickname for her penchant for persecuting and executing Protestants. At least 280 religious dissenters burnt at the stake in what are called the Marian persecutions. She, like her pious mother Catherine of Aragon, was a staunch Catholic. But let's back things up a little bit. Mary was, of course, the beloved daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, but she and her father butted heads during her parents' divorce, and she was declared illegitimate at the age of 17. However, after some gentle coaxing by first Jane Seymour and then Catherine Parr, she was reinstated in the order of succession to the throne by 1544, the same year this portrait was painted. As Edward VI had no children when he died, she sort of inherited the throne, but it's rarely that simple with the Tudors now, is it? Because remember, Edward had named his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as the next in line to the throne, convinced by Lord Protector John Dudley that this was a way to secure his dynastic line as a Protestant. Jane was one of Henry VIII's great nieces, so she was a genuine claimant to the throne, though a rather tenuous one. Dudley then married his own son, Lord Guilford Dudley, to Lady Jane. While the royal council supported Lady Jane's ascendance, the populace overwhelmingly supported Mary, who they saw as the rightful heir, despite her Roman Catholic faith. 2 days into Lady Jane's reign, Dudley departed London with an army, intending to suppress Mary's forces. However, while he was away, the council declared him a traitor and Mary the Queen, which ended Jane's 9-day reign. Mary, not wanting there to be any question about the legitimacy of her rule, had Jane imprisoned in the Tower, and she was executed 6 months later. This iconic painting by Paul Delaroche hangs next door at the National Gallery, and it's featured on my first Top 10 tour there. Don't be put off by the melodrama. French painters in the early 19th century loved Tudor subject matter, and Delaroche added some artistic license here. The beheading took place outdoors, not inside as is shown. However, Jane would have seen her husband's decapitated body being wheeled past just moments before her own death. Poor girl. Now Mary could get down to ruling. Or could she? See, she was committed to making England Catholic again, even though the public was quite satisfied with the new religion, and her brutality made her deeply unpopular. She married Philip II of Spain when she was already 40 years old. She said she had never considered marriage until God raised her to the throne, and she was eager to have an heir. But instead, she had a phantom pregnancy, which was likely ovarian cysts. Her unpopularity spread to handsome young Philip, 10 years her junior. He was always abroad, ruling his own kingdoms, and Mary sank into madness and depression. She soon lost Calais in the war against France, the last vestiges of England's territory since the time of William the Conqueror. This, as well as her inability to sway Parliament to reverse the Reformation and officially restore Catholicism, is said to have tipped her into her final illness. After just 5 years of rule, Mary died, possibly of cancer, in 1558. All of her attempts to re-establish Roman Catholicism were reversed by her younger half-sister and successor, Elizabeth I, who we'll speak about very soon. But before we move on to Elizabeth I, let's just pause here at this portrait of Thomas Cranmer. Another Tudor religious figure executed for his beliefs? You don't say. Cranmer's rise to power takes us back into the life of Henry VIII. He was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533 and secured Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon later the same year. During young Edward VI's reign, Cranmer was responsible for the first Book of Common Prayer, published in 1549 and still used today. He was a committed Protestant and is responsible for a lot of the rites and rituals still used in the Church of England. In this portrait by German painter Gerlach Flick, later imprisoned, likely for his Protestant beliefs, by Mary I, Cranmer holds the epistles of St. Paul and St. Augustine's of Faith and Works, demonstrating his deep scholarly commitment to the question of what was more important, faith or leading a good life. Of course, people still struggle with this question today. The National Portrait Gallery has deep cleaned the painting, revealing 3 areas of broken glass in the window behind Cranmer. These are probably symbolic, maybe symbolizing the broken church or fractured public, but their exact meaning is now unclear. Infrared reflectography revealed the word rot, German for red, beneath the paint layers on the red cushions, which would have been a reminder to the artist of what color to paint them later. I really love that. These little hints in old portraits and paintings that give you a window into the painter's mind and thought process. This was painted at a time when Cranmer was a deeply respected cleric and favorite of Henry VIII. However, his untimely end occurs under the reign of Roman Catholic Mary I, who had him imprisoned and tried for treason. Under duress, and having just witnessed Bishops Ridley and Latimer burned at the stake, Cranmer acknowledged papal supremacy and the truth of Roman Catholic doctrines, except for transubstantiation, but he recanted and reaffirmed his Protestant beliefs just before being burned at the stake in Oxford on 21st of March, 1556. And here's our first introduction to Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn. This is Elizabeth I. This is known as the Coronation portrait, and in it, Elizabeth wears cloth of gold that had also been worn by her sister, Mary I. Now remember, today they do share a tomb at Westminster Abbey. Her 45-year reign is considered one of the most successful in English history, giving rise to the nickname the Golden Age. After a childhood marked by education, she spoke 5 languages. She surrounded herself with sage and wise advisors, such as Francis Walsingham and William Cecil. She also oversaw a time of great exploration, with men like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake swashbuckling on her behalf. Though she is known as the Virgin Queen, she had many legendary favorites throughout her lifetime, such as her true love, Robert Dudley, and Robert Devereaux. We'll be exploring her life and times as we investigate the other portraits in this room, but let's start with her coronation. This painting is known as the Coronation portrait, and it shows the Queen crowned, wearing the cloth of gold that she wore at her coronation on 15th January 1559, previously worn by Mary I. The original was painted in 1559, but this is a copy dating to 1600. Elizabeth is young and fair, having taken the throne at 25 years old. She holds the orb and scepter, symbols of her authority as the monarch. Remember, at the time of her mother, Anne Boleyn's beheading, Elizabeth's eventual crowning seemed extremely unlikely. But here she is, having outlived all of her siblings, even her illegitimate half-brother Henry Fitzroy, to become only the second crowned English queen in her own right. In her later portraits, she is often quite severe, but here she has a subtle smile and looks calm and happy. Though she is the monarch, her hair is long and flowing, which is how queen consorts wore their hair during coronation. This could be a subtle nod to her mother's own coronation. Her robe is embroidered with Tudor roses and fleurs-de-lis, which represented both English soil and the now contested claim to France. Next to the coronation portrait, we have the Darnley portrait. This is the iconic image of Elizabeth, repeated countless times both throughout her life and since. It was painted around 1575, when Elizabeth was around 42 years of age. By the way, we call it the Darnley portrait after a previous owner, the Earl of Darnley. We don't actually know who painted it or who commissioned it, but it appears to be a Netherlandish artistic style. This is what I mean about most portraits of Elizabeth being quite stern and cold. She is impassive and haughty here, wearing a decidedly masculine doublet with a lace ruff collar. We'll talk about ruffs a bit later on, with a double string of pearls looped around her neck, and she's carrying an ostrich feather fan. Her pendant, which may have been given to her by the same courtier who commissioned the painting, is composed of a ruby surrounded by 4 Roman gods. Minerva, representing wisdom, Jupiter, representing sovereignty, Venus, representing love, of course, and Mars, representing war. Her crown is also present in the painting, set on a table next to her so we don't dare forget who she is. But this crown was a later addition, and it wasn't painted by the same artist. The painting has faded substantially. Her complexion would have been a lot rosier, and her dress, which is now kind of gold and brown, would have been crimson and gold and really dazzling on the canvas. Francis Walsingham both established and ran the great Elizabethan equivalent of the Secret Service. Can I just say that I think that Elizabethan spies would make an excellent BBC series? He rose to prominence when he helped to foil the Ridolfi plot, which attempted to replace Protestant Elizabeth with her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, and he would later also foil the Babington plot and the Throckmorton plot, which had the same aims. He championed the rights of the persecuted French Huguenots and oversaw the torture and execution of Catholic priests here in England, almost as a retribution for the violence he witnessed in France during the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. In 1573, he was appointed Secretary of State, and in this role he advised Elizabeth to wage war on Spain, and he predicted the threat of the Armada, and eventually secured the conviction and execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and don't worry, we're going to talk about her shortly. He even attempted to broker a marriage between Elizabeth and Charles IX of France, but he decided that Charles's Catholicism would be too big a problem for that marriage to go ahead. This portrait by John de Cretz shows Walsingham wearing a cameo of the Queen set in gold. He served her faithfully, yet by some accounts she found him personally distasteful and never rewarded him with titles despite his loyalty. Just before we move on, though, let's talk about his ruff. This is the most iconic symbol of Elizabethan era fashion, and Walsingham's is particularly prominent. We'll see a lot of these ruffs on tour. A ruff's placement on a person's neck affected their posture, forcing them to keep their chin up, which gave the impression of pride and haughtiness. Ruffs, particularly this figure of eight style, required a lot of time and effort to maintain, and so they were a visible symbol of status and wealth. This person clearly isn't doing any manual labor, and they can afford a staff to starch and clean that ruff for them. Here we have William Cecil, the first Baron Burleigh. He served both Edward VI and Mary I, but he was most prominent as the chief minister to their sister Elizabeth I, who trusted him implicitly. When she took the throne, she immediately made Cecil her principal Secretary of State, and his cautious and sage wisdom often tempered her spicier temperament.
As a result, the Queen named Cecil her Spirit, which I find quite endearing.
There are actually more portraits of Cecil than any other Elizabethan except for the Queen herself. His main goal was always to unify the British Isles under Protestantism, and he was the one who finally convinced Elizabeth to order the execution of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. In this portrait we can see the inscription, "Do God's will, Cecil, give thy country succour strong, live pious as thy wont is, live as thy need is, long." And speaking of Mary Queen of Scots, here she is. She has an enduring popularity. I get more requests to talk about her than almost any other Tudor player, maybe other than Anne Boleyn. This portrait, once held in the royal collection, includes a Latin inscription that she had been prisoner for 10 years at this point. She is adorned with a rosary and a cross that bears the letter S, possibly for Stuart, on each of its arms. In the center of the cross is a scene depicting Susanna and the elders, surrounded by a Latin motto that says, "Troubles on all sides." And she certainly did attract trouble, mostly by virtue of being not only Catholic, but by being the great-granddaughter of Henry VII of England. That meant she was a legitimate claimant to the English throne at a time in history when the country was ruled by a ruthless queen with no heirs of her own. And of course, I mean her cousin Elizabeth.
Now, Mary Queen of Scots was Elizabeth's immediate heir. She was also direct competition, and a lot of Catholics placed their hope on her for a revolt to overthrow the Reformation, to bring Catholicism back to England and install Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. However, this made Elizabeth very worried, and Mary Queen of Scots was eventually executed for high treason at the Tower of London.
She was the daughter of James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise, and became Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old, before spending her childhood in France to prepare her for her marriage to Francis the Dauphin. In 1558, at the age of just 15, she married Francis, but he died just 2 years later, and she returned to France and married Lord Darnley, with whom she had her little boy, later James I of England and the 6th of Scotland. Darnley was murdered in 1567, and Mary quickly married the Earl of Bothwell, who was soon implicated in Darnley's death, and that painted Mary in a very dodgy light. She was also Catholic and deeply unpopular with the lords of Protestant Scotland. Embroiled in a murder scandal and having lost the support of the people, Mary fled over the border into England and left her 1-year-old son, James, as the sovereign of Scotland. Remember, this all went down in 1568, just 10 years after Elizabeth I took the English throne. She was very wary that many important Catholics wanted to replace her with her cousin, who had a strong and uncontroversial claim to the throne in her own right, and didn't have any of the past scandal of having a mother like Anne Boleyn. After many years of correspondence, some of it loving and some of it icy, Mary believed that Elizabeth would give her protection. Elizabeth, however, wasn't convinced of her cousin's intentions. because of course she was Catholic, and most Catholics believed that Elizabeth was an illegitimate ruler, and for Elizabeth that just wouldn't do. Elizabeth issued order after order for Mary to be held in detention for what would be the rest of her 18.5 years. At the time of this portrait, Mary lived in the custody of George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. She was moved around to his different country estates, and she had luxuries, a large staff, and her own chef. However, she was not allowed outside unsupervised. Eventually, Mary was tried for being a part of the Babington assassination plot against Elizabeth in 1586 and was beheaded at Fotheringay Castle the following year.
Here we have Robert Dudley. Now, I know I've mentioned quite a few favorites of Queen Elizabeth I, but he was her true favorite for a long time, and he was her only serious English suitor.
Robert Dudley, 1st Earl of Leicester. He was the son of the politician John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Remember, he led Edward VI's government and failed to install Lady Jane Grey to the throne. As a charming and influential member of Elizabeth's inner circle, who was known to really like his own image, there are many contemporary portraits of Robert Dudley. Here he is, wearing a rich red suit and a badge of the Order of the Garter. This was likely a full-length portrait that was cut down to half size. Now, if you've heard of Robert Dudley, you probably know of him as one of Elizabeth's serious suitors and a big part of her life, portrayed in dozens of films and television programs. Though we know that they were certainly emotionally dependent on each other, were they actually ever lovers? Weeding through the myths and legends is nearly impossible due to contemporary sources that poisoned the well, such as the anonymous pamphlet Leicester's Commonwealth. In this salacious document, Dudley's character was gleefully assassinated through a recounting of hyperbolic gossip. In the pamphlet, Dudley's a serial killer, extortioner, and criminal. Some of this likely has a grain of truth, as lots of gossip does, but it certainly was overblown. Just like the posthumous myth-making about Richard III that we talked about in part 1, this became Dudley's permanent reputation. But the real Dudley was likely a lot more nuanced, though he was no saint, and he was actually one of the most unpopular men in the Elizabethan court. But Elizabeth really cared for him. They had known each other since young childhood, and both were at risk of losing their heads during the reign of Mary I. Him for the sins of his father, and her for being competition to the throne. This trauma cemented their bond, which became even stronger when Elizabeth became queen in 1558. She made him master of the horse at her accession, and he joined her privy council in 1562, and just 2 years later she named him Earl of Leicester and Baron of Denbigh. They were very attracted to one another, and they rode and whispered and danced together, leading to rumors that they were lovers. However, when she believed she was on her deathbed, she swore that, quote, though she loved him dearly, nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. Keep in mind that Elizabeth would have been terrified of getting pregnant and risking her crown, so it was unlikely that they ever went to bed. But that doesn't mean that they didn't want to. Of course, Dudley was already married to the daughter of a Norfolk squire called Amy Robsart, who was in poor health and therefore never appeared at court. When Amy was found dead with a broken neck, there were inevitable whispers that Dudley had murdered her so he could marry Elizabeth. Despite the fact that he was almost certainly innocent, the rumors that swirled meant Elizabeth could never marry him without jeopardizing her throne. She did want him nearby, though, saying, "I cannot do without my Lord Robert, for he is like my little dog." I mean, a little emasculating, but okay. She even tried to marry him off to her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, to keep him in her clutches and her sights. They bickered and gossiped like an old married couple for years, but Dudley eventually married Lettice Knollys, another cousin of the Queen, in secret, and Elizabeth never spoke to Lettice again, feeling tricked and cast aside, though she did rekindle her friendship with Dudley. Sadly, Dudley died at the age of 55, likely from stomach cancer. Elizabeth entered a period of great grief for her, quote, brother and best friend, and she pined for him for the rest of her life. Here we have Ralph Simons, a Mason architect responsible for the redesign of a number of colleges at Cambridge University. His second court at St. John's College still survives, and of course Cambridge is a wonderful day trip from London. This portrait, dating to around 1595, is the earliest known portrait of an artisan in England. His craft is well represented in the portrait. He holds a pair of dividers in his right hand, which could take the form of a dagger when closed. They were used for marking measurements on the ground rather than drawing. We can see his brown leather jerkin with embroidered detailing and decorative tabs at the sleeves. Simons is dressed simply, no silks, like a nobleman would wear, but he is styled elegantly, and of course he has a figure-of-8 ruff, which marks him as more than a common labourer. While Sir Francis Drake is remembered as a swashbuckling maritime hero here in England, the Spanish remember him as a terrifying pirate, El Drac, or the Dragon. He was also a privateer who participated in early slaving missions alongside his cousin Sir John Hawkins, and of course he is best known for his circumnavigation of the world in a single expedition between 1577 and 1580, the first such English circumnavigation. In 1577, Elizabeth commissioned him to lead an expedition to South America through the Straits of Magellan.
Drake's ship, the Pelican, which was later renamed the Golden Hind, was actually the only one to reach the Pacific.
This mission was funded by some familiar faces, including Francis Walsingham and Robert Dudley, as well as Drake himself, and it certainly curried favour. He sailed into Plymouth with a rich cargo of spices and captured Spanish treasures, and the Queen's half share of the cargo was more than the Crown's income for the entire year. Born into a seafaring family in Devon, he rose the ranks in both the English Navy and as a private sea captain. After his successful circumnavigation, Elizabeth I awarded him with a knighthood that he received aboard his galleon, the Golden Hind. As an aside, there's a scale replica of the Golden Hind on the South Bank in London, and it's great for kids. As a national hero of the day, the public was clamoring for portraits of Drake. Therefore, he was painted in a number of full-length portraits, such as this one by an unknown artist. Here he is, dressed in a satin doublet with slashed sleeves and a bright red jerkin and hose. The Queen had bestowed him with the majestic Drake jewel at this point, a rare honour for a commoner, but it does not appear in this painting. Above his coat of arms, we can see a crest that depicts the hand of God leading the Golden Hind. The message is implicit. In Elizabethan England, God was on Drake's side, and therefore England's side. He's also got a pretty fancy ruff on. In the 1580s, he was the mayor of Plymouth and became a member of Parliament, and in 1585, after war broke out between England and Spain, he was ordered by Elizabeth to lead an expedition to attack the Spanish colonies in the Americas as a preemptive strike, and he returned as a hero the following year. He continued to successfully defend England both at home and abroad, but by his mid-50s, his defeats were beginning to rack up. He died of dysentery off the coast of Portobello, Panama, on 28th January 1596. It was, of course, a common disease at the time, but a very undignified death. He was then dressed in his full armour, which was his dying wish, and buried at sea in a sealed, lead-lined coffin. This dashing chap is Sir Walter Raleigh, a true Renaissance man who made quite an impression on our Virgin Queen. He was a famous explorer, soldier, sailor, courtier, and poet, but sadly only about 30 short poems and passages of prose survive, including his The History of the World, which he wrote while imprisoned in the Tower of London. After organizing and financing a number of North American expeditions and acting as a leading proponent of the colonization of America, he attempted, unsuccessfully, to find the mythical El Dorado gold in South America. Though he was at times a loyal friend to Elizabeth I, his reckless behavior and secret marriage to lady-in-waiting Bess Throckmorton displeased the Queen, and he landed in the Tower 3 times. During the reign of her successor, he was implicated in the main plot against James I, and finally met his end when he was executed for treason at Westminster Palace in 1618.
In this portrait, dating to 1588, he is lavishly bedecked in pearls, including a very cool pearl earring. Pearls were purity symbols beloved by Elizabeth I. We can see that the pearls on his cloak form the rays of a sun in splendor, a common heraldic device. After painstaking conservation, curators found a patch of wavy water beneath this crescent moon, which symbolizes Elizabeth I as the moon goddess Cynthia. This shows that Raleigh is submitting to being controlled by the Queen, just as the moon controls the tides. Another favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, Lee was known for his love of a good time. I know you might not be able to tell that from his pretty dour expression, though. He held the title of the Queen's Champion, which means that he rode on a white charger fully clad in armour into Westminster Hall during the Coronation banquet, and quite literally threw down a gauntlet and cried out to those who would deny the sovereign's status. This is a tradition that dates to William the Conqueror, but since George IV, it is more of a symbolic role. At Charles III's recent coronation, the champion, who is a chartered accountant called Francis Dymock, carried a standard instead of throwing down a gauntlet. I really love this portrait, which features true lover's knots and armillary astrolabes on his sleeves. These were personal symbols of the Queen's, and likely reference his role as her champion. Like the Whitehall portrait of Henry VIII, these intricate patterns were outlined with a transfer technique called pouncing. The artist, Antonio Moro, one of the most important and accomplished artists working in Europe at the time, pricked holes in a pattern and shook charcoal dust through those pricked holes. Henry Lee was clearly good friends with Edward, 3rd Baron of Windsor, an important English peer at the time. They visited Antwerp together for these portraits in June of 1568 and were both painted by Moro. In both portraits, they have their thumbs through a ring, a gesture related to the bonds of love or friendship. Anyway, I love his epitaph. He himself, right and steady in the many dangerous shocks and utter turns of the state. Tough to do in Elizabethan England. He had a beautiful estate in Ditchley, which is where he welcomed Elizabeth on an official visit and commissioned this portrait of her. As a favourite of the Queen, he took it upon himself to arrange a lavish programme of entertainment for her in September 1592, held at the grounds of his house in Ditchley, near Oxford. This is after he had retired from his role as champion and moved to Ditchley with his mistress, Anne Vavasour. This celebration officially marked the Queen's forgiveness of Lee for becoming a stranger lady's thrall. Being friends with Elizabeth seems very complicated and high maintenance. In this large portrait, Elizabeth is standing on the globe with her feet painted in Oxfordshire. Specifically, one is placed on Ditchley. Though the sky is stormy, the clouds are starting to reveal sunshine. The painting includes 3 Latin inscriptions, all relating to forgiveness. These include, "She gives and does not expect," "She can, but does not take revenge," and "In giving back, she increases." Pretty elaborate apology, if you ask me. But a pretty understandable apology for someone who can easily have you executed at Tower Hill. This unusual painting is one of the strangest in the galleries, if not in the entire museum. It's a narrative portrait of some of the major events in Sir Henry Unton's life, commissioned posthumously by his widow, Dorothy Wroughton. It should really be called the Portraits of Henry Unton because it features 10 images of the same man throughout his lifetime. Before we dive into the portrait, though, let's talk a little bit about who Unton was. He was a diplomat and member of Parliament, but he wasn't really a member of Elizabeth's inner circle. And let's be honest, if this portrait wasn't so strange and wonderful, he probably wouldn't be featured in this gallery or on this tour at all. This is just very good PR on the part of his widow. Let's have a closer look at the painting's narrative. It begins with Unton at his desk, and we can see two allegorical figures that are overseeing the events of Unton's life. On his left, Death, a skeletal figure, holds an hourglass, which was a common memento mori to remind people that time is fleeting and you should consider your mortality and the afterlife in everything that you do, and live a virtuous life to prepare. Above his right shoulder, we can see another reminder of everlasting life, in a way, the winged figure of Fame. And he is famous. We're talking about him today. Fame offers Henry her crown and trumpets his memory. On opposite sides of the painting, we can see a smiling sun and a crescent moon, reminding us of the inevitable passage of time. The sun's rays point to specific moments in his life, including as an infant in the arms of his mother, his time studying at Oriel College, Oxford, travels to Venice and Padua, serving abroad on diplomatic missions with Robert Dudley, and here on his deathbed. The rest of his scenes depict him living at his Oxford home and scenes from his funeral and wake. Finally, we see Unton's effigy and the kneeling figure of his widow, who commissioned this deeply personal painting. Look here at the center of the painting. We see Unton looking at us from his desk, writing important letters and wearing a cameo on a chain. King Henry IV of France is on the cameo, referencing Unton's role as England's ambassador to France. It's an easy detail to miss, but so important to Unton's life. This painting of Queen Elizabeth I's final favourite, Robert Devereaux, 2nd Earl of Essex, was painted by Marcus Geraerts the Younger, a Netherlandish court painter favoured by the Tudors. Devereaux was the master of the horse, which means he was an important official in the Queen's household and was in charge of royal entertainment. As the great-grandson of Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister, he was also Elizabeth I's first cousin, twice removed, and he was the son of Lettice Knollys, the other woman that Robert Dudley had married. Elizabethan family trees are very convoluted. He was a military hero after winning battles in Spain, but after his campaign performed poorly during the 9 Years' War with Ireland, he appeared at Nonsuch Palace and surprised Elizabeth in her bedchamber before she was wigged and gowned. She was mortified and irate with him, and he was placed under house arrest. After 11 months, he was granted freedom, but he clearly had a lingering anger at the Queen for his arrest, and he tried to raise a rebellion against her ministers in 1601. This failed, and he was executed for treason. On 25th February 1601, he was beheaded on Tower Green. Devereaux was actually the last person to be beheaded at the Tower of London. In many ways, Sidney is the ideal Renaissance courtier. He was a soldier, diplomat, and author, but is perhaps best known as a poet, known for his romance prose Arcadia and the sonnet sequence Astrophel and Stella. He was also the nephew of Robert Dudley, which likely secured him a place of prestige in Elizabeth's orbit. Though he was a great mind and poet, none of his works were published during his lifetime, instead published by his sister Mary after his death. Despite his success as a politician, he continued to battle as a soldier and died in 1586 at the young age of 31 when fighting the Spanish in the Netherlands on his uncle, the Earl of Leicester's expedition. Sidney was shot in the thigh and died of gangrene 26 days later. A potentially apocryphal account of his death is that he noticed his men were not all fully armored, and so he took off his thigh armaments to keep things equal, and he was soon shot. According to the same lore, he gave his water to another wounded soldier, and said, "Thy necessity is yet greater than mine." These instances have given rise to something called the Phillips-Sidney game, which is kind of an ethical exercise given to students in biology and game theory. Here we have another portrait of Mary I, much later in her life. Painted by Hans Eworth, a Flemish painter, this portrait was based on a sitting in 1554, and Eworth went on to paint a portrait of her and her husband Philip II of Spain just a few years later. When she first met her husband, he is said to have cursed the artist who previously painted her for making her look more attractive than in reality, which really reminds me a lot of the rumors that get spread about how Henry VIII felt about Anne of Cleves. Poor Mary. She does look quite intense here, I must say. We can see the pear-shaped pearl attached to the brooch on her chest. Until recently, this was commonly thought to be a famous pearl called La Peregrina, which was thought to have been a wedding present from Philip II to Mary in June 1554. But recent scholarship shows it was actually brought to Seville from Panama in 1579, which was 21 years after Mary's death. No, this stunning brooch was probably inherited from Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last queen, who I speak about at length in part 1. Our final portrait of Elizabeth, and the final portrait on our 2-part tour, is called the Phoenix Portrait, which was displayed at the Tate Britain until the National Portrait Gallery recently reopened. It's known as the Phoenix Portrait after the prominent phoenix jewel that she wears on her chest. There is an almost carbon copy of this painting called the Pelican Portrait, in which the phoenix is replaced by a pelican. It was believed that pelicans fed their own young with their blood, so the bird was a common symbol of Christian self-sacrifice. Both paintings are likely based on a miniature by Nicholas Hilliard, painted in 1572. By this time, nearly a decade and a half into her reign, Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen was well established, and many of her future portraits reflect this symbolism. The prominent phoenix jewel that Elizabeth wears at her throat, symbolizing rebirth and Christianity, became a common image associated with Elizabeth as a way to reassure the public that even though she was unmarried, she was married to the English people, and she would somehow be able to regenerate her dynasty, like a phoenix can regenerate from the ashes of a fire. She was never sure how she could negotiate her role as queen with the role of wife to a husband who would be ranked beneath her. Perhaps she saw the struggles that her half-sister Mary experienced with her husband Philip, himself the King of Spain. Here she's also holding a red rose, a symbol of her Tudor lineage, and her heavily jeweled collar evokes her very complicated father, the most famous Tudor, Henry VIII. And he is a fitting person to mention at the end of our tour as I leave the National Portrait Gallery's Tudor room. Well, that's it. It was a mission, but we made it through every single portrait in the Tudor Gallery here at the newly reopened National Portrait Gallery. I hope that you enjoyed this tour as much as I enjoyed making it, researching it, and presenting it to you. For now, though, I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.